Welcome to the Stratinis webinar about pricing strategies in emerging markets versus mature markets. My name is Finn Hansen. I'm the CEO and founder of Stratinis. Please be aware that we are recording the webinar for later usage. We will also later make the recording available from our extranet so it can be shared with your colleagues. Similarly, we will send the charts as a PDF file to all participants after the webinar. We love to have questions, and there will be time after the presentation to ask questions. However, initially all telephones will be muted to reduce background noise, and we will open up the telephones by the end of the webinar to take questions. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, you can also use the chat facility in the GoToMeeting software, as you can see here on the screen. Also, if you want to learn more about Stratinis in general, please visit our website or some of the other information channels that we use. So today's webinar is about managing different pricing strategies in emerging markets and mature markets. So what is the challenge really there, and why are we bothering to look at this topic? Well, the whole idea is that if you're a pricing manager, is that you will differentiate your prices to match the customers or consumers' willingness to pay. That applies in a single country, so you will have in a single country customers who are either willing to pay more or who will receive more discounts than others, and therefore a lower net price based on various characteristics of that customer, be it willingness to pay, be it size, be it purchase patterns, be it things that you do in cooperation with the customer. And similarly, the philosophy or the thought behind a differentiated pricing strategy between emerging markets and mature markets is that you do need to differentiate, or you can differentiate according to these markets' willingness to pay, or actually even ability to pay, so that in some markets, possibly mature markets, you may have a higher price, and in emerging markets you may have a more penetrative lower price. However, there are certain aspects of this kind of pricing strategy that either may cause problems or will allow you to set up a strong pricing strategy that will allow you to make more profits. But the overall idea is, in classical economic theory, is of course that if customers are moving on the demand curves, then if you can actually differentiate between two markets and you can charge a higher price in one market and a lower price in another market, it brings more profit than if you simply charge everybody the same price. One question we often hear, and one of the questions we will also address in this webinar, is do emerging markets actually necessitate a lower price than mature markets, or could I actually have a higher price? Well, obviously it depends on what kind of market it is, and also what you want to do in that market. What is your market strategy, or how you want to enter this market? How do you want to defend yourself in that market? Are you alone in the market, or do you have competitors in the same market? Quite a few factors can play a role in that decision. Similarly, a question we often hear is, well, how do you use pricing to gain market share in an emerging market? Well, if emerging market means that it's growing strongly, maybe you don't need to gain market share. Maybe it's more about growing the market as such. Or if it is an emerging market that's where you are absolutely dominant, you have a very large market share, by all means you can't really, well, if you go from 80 to 81% of market share, it doesn't really change much. But if you double the market size, you are the market in itself. Also, how do you use that? So how do you use pricing to develop the emerging market? Are there certain tricks, or are there certain barriers to how you can actually develop the market by using pricing, discounting policies, etc.? We'll come back to some of those elements as well. And of course, also one of the risks of international price differentiation or pricing strategy differentiation is that you may end up charging different prices for the same product, or at least a very similar product, across different countries. Those of you working with international key accounts will know that that may cause some problems in terms of that these key accounts will exploit those price differences. In some industries, for example, pharmaceuticals or consumer goods, automotive spare parts. There's typically also a lot of gray market, parallel market going around, i.e. customers buying in the cheapest market and then re-exporting those products into more expensive markets, at least as long as the products are either identical or similar enough that it's worth moving those goods around. But we'll come back to some of those challenges as well. So how do you assess a market, and how do you go about looking at how the market should be treated in terms of pricing practice or pricing strategy? Well, we have different levels or different areas to look at. One of them is the market attractiveness. Is it an attractive market as such? Are you able to actually make a profit in that market either today or in the future? Which of course also ties into the growth potential. So is it a market where there's a lot of growth potential, or is it a small market where basically it's difficult to, yes, you may grow the market, but if it's still only going to deliver you 5% of what one of the bigger markets would deliver, maybe it's not really worth the investment. And of course also overall, what's the investment required? An investment in this sense can be, of course, general market investments, setting up subsidiaries, investing in marketing, investing in sales force, but definitely also how are you going to invest in terms of price? Are you going to have a lower price as an entry point, or are you going to have a higher price and make profit from day one? And how much money are you basically going to either win or lose by having a certain pricing strategy? One of the key drivers we often see in a differentiated market approach is the level of competitiveness. If you are the only player in the market or the dominant player in the market, there's a tendency for many companies to, of course, have a higher price than if there's a number of competitors who are all fighting fiercely on price. But also things like the willingness to pay, or as I said before, the ability to pay is quite important. But also the threats from international trade. If there are no threats from international trade, you may be able to maintain a higher price than if goods from lower price markets are threatening to flow into that country on a daily basis. Examples of that have been, for example, in many consumer goods areas in Russia, where Western goods have actually traded at a much higher price in Russia than they have in for example, Western Europe, based on that Russia has had until now some custom barriers. That means that if you take consumer goods, for example, that the designated importer of that brand into Russia is the only one who's allowed to import goods into Russia, and anyone else who would import goods into who would import that brand into Russia would be stopped in customs. That is going to change, and this example is going to change with Russia joining WTO. But it's just one example of a barrier that means that actually maybe there may in some markets not be so much of a threat from international trade. In other markets, the European Union is a good example. It is strictly forbidden to prohibit international trade inside the European Union between European Union member countries, and therefore the threat from international trade is usually much higher, depending, of course, on the industry. Another area of market assessment is the current price levels. If you're already achieving a relatively high price or a profitable price, there may not necessarily be a reason to change that pricing strategy. Whereas if you're currently, of course, it ties into the ability to make a profit, but if you're currently at a lower price level, it may be a market that is less attractive, because as we often know is that once you've established the price level in the mind of the customers or in the mind of the consumers, depending on the industry, then it may be quite difficult to really increase the price. It's always easier to lower the price. It's one of the things we often see among electronics manufacturers, where also economies of scale mean that the first units off the production line, they're quite expensive, but once they start selling millions of units, it's much easier to sell at a lower price, and consumers and customers are willing to accept that. The other way around, starting with a low price and then suddenly over a year to double the price, is almost never possible. And the last point in terms of market assessment, of course, is also linked to strategy. Whether or not you have a penetration strategy where you really want to develop the market share, you want to develop the market as such, or if you're more in a defensive mode where basically your pricing strategy and pricing tactics depend mostly on whether or not competition does something, and as long as competition leaves you alone, you're not going to do too much yourselves either. At least in terms of discounting, and you know everybody keeps a very high price or a relatively high price. For assessing market differentiation and also looking at how to differentiate pricing strategy between markets, and also assessing that in some markets you may not want to differentiate so much. We have this framework that we've created, basically looking at different areas of pricing strategy and also market strategy or market approach. The first level really starts with clustering, i.e. a methodology for segmenting markets and looking at what are the common attributes, what are the commonalities between markets that dictate that you will want to have a similar market strategy, a similar pricing strategy in that group of countries, what we call a cluster. Obviously, you have different strategy options, whether it should be a penetrations pricing, whether it should be a defensive pricing, whether it should be basically milking the market as much as you can with as high price as possible, but really different strategic options. We are going to look at price structure optimization. So how can you actually at least assess, but maybe also change the way you do pricing? How can you change your price structure so it's more geared towards handling a differentiated pricing strategy by country, even, for example, inside the European Union, where in theory you have a lot of goods that could flow around. How do you optimize your price structure so that you can still keep some price differences between different countries in the European Union, or of course globally? And yes, again, also how do you actually manage those price differences that may come from a pricing strategy differentiation? How do you actually manage when the product costs 50 euros in Poland, but 40 euros in the Czech Republic and 75 euros in Germany? How do you handle those kind of things? Importantly enough, also in every aspect of pricing, and for those of you who attended other webinars from Stratinis, you will hear us say it again and again, communication about pricing is very important, both internally and as well as externally. Pricing is a communication tool in itself. If I have a high price and I communicate on that, it really does send a message to my customers, and the same if I have a low price. And because we're looking at an area that's also sometimes governed by legal constraints when it comes to price differentiation and price discrimination, it's good in the framework also to have a look at the legal aspects of things. So those are the elements that we're going to look at for that. When it comes to clustering, the first area, the idea is really to group markets according to attractiveness and put markets into certain clusters. There's no right or wrong on how many clusters you have, what kind of clusters you have, and even what kind of attributes you use for creating the clusters. The objective is really to differentiate the pricing strategy per cluster, to optimize profit, and also to fit with the global market strategy. So in terms of market conquering and market domination, how do you actually go about rolling out your products globally? And therefore, it's important to differentiate your pricing strategy according to these clusters. Now, as I said, how many clusters you have, what kind of clusters you have, may vary from company to company, may vary from industry to industry. And it's just, we'll give you an example here on the next page. It's an example from a consumer goods manufacturer where basically they are looking at the market attractiveness, they're looking at the level of competitiveness, they are looking at what kind of pricing they're getting today, and they're also looking at the threat from international trade, with 1 being the worst and 5 being the best situation for the manufacturer. So if we take the example here, they are selling in Denmark. In terms of market attractiveness, it's a mature Western European market, but it's also not too big a market in terms of inhabitants and in terms of customers. So they've given it as a 3. Now, because it's also small, there are not that many competitors, but there are some. They have a price level that means that they're actually achieving quite well, but because it's also European Union, they're giving it a 2 when it comes to international trade threats, because goods can flow into this country from other European Union countries. On the other hand, they have the USA, which in their industry, of course it's a large market by such, actually for some very specific reasons. They have a very large market share in that country, and therefore they feel that the level of competitors is actually good for them. But on the other hand, they also have a price level that's pretty good, and they don't really have a lot of threats from international trade, partly due to some characteristics of it. If you're looking at China, Indonesia, and France, they've also categorized them according to some of these, or scored them according to these criteria. And what comes out of it is that they've actually said that they're going to treat these markets in a couple of different ways. So Denmark, they're basically going to exploit, meaning that they will try to get as much profit out of the market. They have a medium price strategy, so it's the medium level, globally speaking, in this company, where they want to achieve their pricing. USA, they consider a mature market, but also with higher pricing, because they're capable of getting away with a higher price due to the lack of competitiveness. As I said, this is a disguised example, so it may be different countries, but the point is still that they can achieve a higher market price in this market. China is a growth market. They actually, for other reasons, for legal reasons among other things, they can actually achieve a relatively high price. Indonesia, they see as a quite strong potential market, a lot of inhabitants, almost 200 million inhabitants long term. On the other hand, they also believe that they need to have a lower price, because they need to fight more for both market share and market growth, and therefore they're keeping a lower pricing strategy. And France again is a mature market and also a medium price, where they because of the threat from international trade, they're focusing on a medium level pricing. When it comes to different market types, and we already touched a little bit on these are some really good examples that a lot of companies will be using. So exploit markets will be insignificant markets where you either don't have a lot of market share, or you don't really see a strong growth potential. Potential markets may be smaller markets where there's a growth potential, but they're small today. Growth markets may be markets where there's a growth potential, and you may already have a certain size. And mature markets are more characterized by that there's limited growth, but typically they have a larger size. Otherwise, they would probably be categorized in the insignificant group if they were small but mature. And in terms of overall pricing strategies, some of the key examples here are to either go for profits, so optimize the profits per unit. That's typically a high price strategy, where you're pursuing as much as you can get out of the marketplace. Typically, they fit quite well with exploit markets or sometimes with mature markets. To build market share, so stable markets where you're basically looking for, you want to grow your market share, that's typically characterized by slightly lower pricing. And then to build the market itself, so it's typically emerging markets where you either are dominant or where you're simply building the market together with competitors. There it's typically somewhere around the medium price level to really grow. And if I'm using the examples from before, you can see here that we've put Denmark in the exploit category as before. It's an exploit market, and the aim is maybe to make profit per unit. If you're looking at something like Indonesia, it's more of a build market where you want to see the pricing. You want to have a medium pricing strategy, but it's also because of the potential. China has already grown for a number of years for this company, so yes, they continue to grow, and therefore also, but they're also building market share more than just the market now. And both France and US are large markets where it's more about making profit per unit and using a strong market position in those markets. As I said in the beginning, we will also share all of these examples as a PDF file in the end of the webinar, so you will be able to see it all at your own time at a later stage. When it comes to price structure optimization, there's quite a few different elements and quite a few different considerations to have. Obviously, depending on whether you're selling through your own subsidiaries or whether you're selling distributors, there may be some mechanisms you can and cannot execute to the same extent. Even though even through distributors, we often see that, especially discounting through chargebacks, discounting through marketing contributions to the final customer, i.e. the customer of the distributor, can still be used to differentiate pricing quite substantially between different countries. The first question we often see is really about optimizing the price structure according to discount types, and also to changing the discount types into non-exportable discount types. The simple example is that if you're giving a lot of discounts in two countries, but you actually end up having a lower price here in country one than a lower pocket price in country one than you have in country two. If some of these discounts here that are given in country one are not exportable, let's say the red box here is not exportable because it's a discount given for a local performance or tied into a local service, well, then in reality, anyone buying in country one would only be able to buy at the price signified as between the red and the green boxes. In other words, they will not be able to export back into to country two, or at least it wouldn't be profitable for a customer to be exporting to country two. But more importantly, it can also be for why you're giving these discounts. Another area of price structure optimization can be complexity. Again, if you do have neighboring countries or differentiated countries where you have different pricing strategies and you do want to have a lower net price in, let's say, Poland than in Germany, that is your strategy. If you create pricing structures that have complexity, it still means that your customers may not be able to exploit that net price difference between the two countries. This, of course, with the caveat that these complexities need to be manageable, which is typically a question of either systems or processes, that you have the right systems in place or you have the right processes in place to be able to manage complexity. But complexity in international pricing is often the friend of a manufacturer or a supplier, because it means you can actually disguise or at least manage differences in prices much better. Complexity also often means that you have different discount types to give, and you may the more different discount types you are, the more. But if you have quite a substantial toolbox of discount type to give, you may also be able to encourage certain behavior in the emerging markets that you don't want to encourage in mature markets by offering different discount types in different markets. And as I said, also one key element is to adjust the purposes of spending between the countries. So maybe you want to encourage market penetration in one market. Maybe you want to encourage supply chain optimization in a more mature market because you really just want to get the most out of your value chain, and therefore the kind of discounts that you're offering in different countries may vary, even if the overall structure, the net price, etc., may be quite similar. You may adjust the numbers up or down. A good example of a way to differentiate the discounts given according to why they're given, and do that across different markets for different purposes, is what we here call the business driver management, or this business driver hierarchy. The idea is to classify all discounts according to business drivers or to the purpose. So this is an example from a consumer goods manufacturer who has classified all discounts given according to these 7 main categories and then some subcategories below. So whether or not the discount is given for financial improvement, whether discount is given for supply chain improvement, whether the discount is given for assortment, i.e. how many products the customer is carrying, if the discount is given for running various point-of-sale activities, typically when they differentiate here between concepts, i.e. static or display concepts, and promotions where the consumers, in their case, get a discount. Also category improvement, where they basically, in their product category, they get favorable treatment, and as well as a category called others. Now they created this because they felt that they had quite a few of the discounts that would fall into the category of others, i.e. no purpose whatsoever, but also to look at that they were actually given more than 5% of their total discounts for financial improvement, even though a cash discount, if you're getting a 2% or 5% cash discount after to pay cash rather than after 30 days, well, it's a very good interest rate and really not in the interest of the manufacturer. But for the purposes of price differentiation and pricing in emerging markets in particular, this kind of classification of discounts can also be used to set up rules about or guidelines per cluster for spend types. So as I mentioned a little bit before, you may want to, if you are an emerging market, you may want to spread the knowledge of your brand. You may want to spread the trial of your product if it's a consumer product. You may want to spread the trial among business-to-business customers if you are in business to business, and thereby probably you would encourage your markets, your subsidiaries, your distributors to have a higher spend on, for example, promotion, and maybe also assortment, is making sure that your products are actually sold to this customer. If you're on the other hand, if you're in a mature market where you don't really have too many improvements in terms of gaining more end customers or end consumers, you may want to focus a higher amount of your discount spend on supply chain improvement or financial improvement, where it's also in your benefit if, for example, you can deliver, the customer comes to your warehouse and picks up the goods rather than you have to deliver the goods. That's worth a discount, and is more focused on internal optimization rather than on external optimization. Obviously, this is just an example from one company, and the business driver hierarchy would typically be created per company, but it does allow for actually setting some guidelines and then over time to adjust the discounting spend levels between the purposes of that market or that market cluster, so to speak. When it comes to gray markets or parallel markets, some people call them, where there's a risk of goods moving around from international pricing differences. Well, in the old days, and the old days not that many years ago, the main risk was from physical movement of goods, i.e., well, I sell a product for 20 in Italy and for 25 in France. Well, then more of my French customers will buy their needs in Italy instead, and thereby will only make 20 rather than 25. These days, the virtual threat is there as well. Clearly that some customers and some companies are capable of exploiting those differences without actually physically moving the goods around. They can either see in various market research, or if they're buying from the manufacturer in different countries, they can see in their own IT systems that, well, there's a price difference, and they're using that ruthlessly in negotiations. So instead of actually moving the goods from Italy to France, the French buyer will simply look up and say, okay, I can see here on my computer screen that your price for the same product is 20 in Italy, and you're asking me for 25 in France. Can I please have the 20 that you should be offering me here in France? So it's actually the goods are no longer flowing around. It's more virtual gray market, of course, with a threat of physical goods moving around if the discounts are not given. Now, how do you counter that? Well, there are many different ways to look at that, and there's many different ways to treat it. One of them is to employ a pricing corridor, where you basically have the green dot can either be a customer or a country, but basically enforcing that you have an average or a median and then every market has to be within a certain percentage of deviation from the median. That we typically see in many companies. So that's a first good step to manage price differences between countries. How big the corridor is, how big the deviation from the median or from the average may depend on the industry, may depend on the threat of goods actually physically moving around. How much does it cost to move something from one country to another? What is defendable? But by forcing all markets to be within the corridor, you avoid some of the gray market risks. We do also see that some companies will apply a corridor per cluster, so that there will still be within a cluster there will be one corridor, but another cluster may have a different pricing corridor with a different median and a different minimum floor price and a maximum ceiling. Also to make sure that you can still apply the pricing strategies that you want. As I mentioned before, another tool is non-exportable discounts. If a discount is tied to a local activity or to getting a local service that you can only get if you're buying locally, well then those discounts will be less exportable and are perfectly legal as well. Another tool we've seen in quite a few industries, some with more success than others, are differentiated products. So that it's not quite the same product. It may be a slightly different product. It may be a very different product. We've seen that in consumer goods, where, as an example, without mentioning any names, but let's say a box of candy or a bottle of something may have a slightly different size. Maybe in one country it's 75 centiliters, in another country it's 70 centiliters. Maybe in one country the box of candy is 50 grams, and in another country it's 55 grams. And thereby you have slightly differentiated products that makes it more difficult for professional buyers and professional companies to exploit those price differences, or at least to understand those price differences. We've also seen it in certain industrial components or automotive spare parts, that there are some differentiated products in some areas. In particular, in consumer goods, differentiated product strategy has not worked as well as it should, because these international buyers have actually then looked at it and said, well, I know that it's a 55-gram pack in one country, and I know it's a 60-gram pack in another country, but quite frankly, it's the same product. And you're not trying to cheat me out of a substantial price difference. It's a 50% price difference, and I don't really want to accept that. It is the same product. Please cough up. In other industries where it's more of technical nature, where there's a larger service amount into the product as well, there's also the local service bundling. It's usually a better tool in terms of managing those price differences that you get as a result of the more penetration pricing in emerging markets. And as I said before, the general pricing complexity can also be used as a tool for managing complexity. A sub-problem of that is international key accounts. So in some industries, there are international key accounts who are actually buying through local subsidiaries from local subsidiaries of the supplier. And as you can imagine, if you have a differentiated pricing strategy where you may have a very high price in Germany, but you have a lower price in Japan, and you have a medium price in UK. And by the way, the UK price also varies because of the UK British pound. Then you actually end up charging the same customer different pricing. It's not so much a problem in industries or in companies where you're basically dealing and you're doing one single price between the supplier and the buyer. Then you don't have the price difference, but then you have a problem in that, let's say your market strategy is for Japan to have a lower price than it is in Germany, because you would generally want to grow your market share in Japan. But because you are selling to the buyer at the headquarter level, and you're selling to that buyer at the same price, you will either have to align their price with the Japanese price or to the German price. If you have an international customer price that you are charging that you're charging to this customer that is above the price in Japan, of course they will complain about that. And if you're charging below the price that you would in Germany because you've aligned your international price to Japan, then you're losing out on Germany, even though of course you wouldn't really hear this customer complaining, but you may have other customers in Germany who complain that they have to pay a higher price than this international customer is paying. Not to mention that that may in some instances also have legal implications. So in both cases you have some challenges when you have a differentiated international pricing strategy. Communication is key as well. You could even say communication is golden here. When it comes to differentiated pricing strategies per country and in emerging markets, well, internal communication can be quite important. And partly to explain the reasons for price differentiation, you will have some countries who will look at, oh well, why can they sell at a much lower price than we have to? We feel it's unfair. We could develop the market much more if we could sell at such a low price that they can. And it's not really fair to us that we are being designated as a milk market or a mature market, and therefore we can't offer the same price to our customers. You even also have the case where so explaining the reasons, getting buy-in from local people, at least local management, is quite important. But also, if you, for example, have a differentiated pricing strategy where you have actually some goods ending up flowing from the cheap market to the expensive market, we've seen several companies working on some sort of internal compensation schemes, compensation in inverted commas, in the sense that of course they're not getting personally money, but if there's a flow of goods from a cheaper market into to an expensive market, then the manager of the expensive market gets some sort of acceptance that he may need to hit a lower budget number, or that he gets an adjustment for his growth targets, so that he doesn't have to grow the same amount because the goods are coming from one of his colleagues. It's of course, as the price differences are a consequence of the pricing strategy and the overall market strategy. This is a good way of not getting too much internal resistance or internal problems with executing that strategy. When it comes to external communication, apart from that, as I mentioned before, pricing is communication as well. And therefore you are sending certain messages to your customers, regardless if you are lowering the price because you want to penetrate the market, or regardless of if you are keeping a high price because you want to milk the market. But on top of that, a differentiated pricing strategy sometimes also has the need for external communication in terms of being considered unfair. That typically happens with large international brands or with general companies who are well known either in the industry or in the public, and then either journalists or buyers are recognizing that there are what they consider to be unfair price differences between China, Brazil, and Germany. If you take examples like Apple or Microsoft, they've both had some bad publicity in the past, where if you buy Apple equipment or if you buy Microsoft software, there's actually quite considerable price differences that are not really justified in any way. And because they're so well-known brands, they've also gotten quite a lot of press about it. But if you look at then how they handle the communication, they've actually also handled it quite well, and explained some of the differences, even though probably Microsoft has a slightly different communication style than, for example, Apple. But again, communication about pricing, whether it's internal or external, is also very important. And the last aspect of differentiating your pricing strategy between markets is that there are some legal constraints as well. In the U.S., there's the Robertson-Patman Act. It's actually a quite old law, governing that you can only differentiate pricing at certain on certain customer attributes and not on others. You can't anymore, if you're selling directly to consumers, you can't If there's an impact on competition, then you can't simply differentiate only based on quantity sold. The European Union has the Article 82C of the main treaty of the Treaty of Rome, where basically it's if you have a dominant position, i.e. if you have more than 30% market share, it is not permitted to simply differentiate pricing without justification. Now, what does justification mean? Well, justification can't be that, well, you like one customer more than the other. That's definitely illegal. But there can be some differentiation still permitted, whereas other types of differentiation are not permitted. And similarly, many countries do have local laws that will allow for price discrimination if it's based on differentiated products, if it's based on differentiated customer performance towards the supplier, but will also outlaw certain price discriminations if it's if there's no fact-based differentiation. Key topics normally in Europe, it's about dominant market share or dominant position. So if you have too high a market share, then there are certain things you can't do in terms of pricing differentiation that you can do if you have less than, for example, 30%. And in the U.S., as I mentioned, it's one of the key areas is whether it has an impact on competition or not. But I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and we should also be always careful about what you can and cannot do. You can do many things in terms of international pricing differentiation, more internationally actually than nationally. Often because there is an argument to be had that different markets are different, and therefore you need to price differently. But it's always a good advice to get some legal advice from a lawyer or legal expert before executing a differentiated pricing strategy, in particular when it comes to regions such as the European Union or the United States as such. So what are the steps to a differentiated pricing approach? Well, first, to have a framework for classifying the markets. So how do you classify the markets? What are your clusters that you want to group all your markets into? Then to set a strategy per market cluster. So what is your pricing strategy? What do you want to achieve in each cluster? Do you want to conquer market share in emerging markets? Do you want to milk the mature markets? As I mentioned before, especially if you're doing new stuff, have a legal check. It might be worth the effort and the cost to avoid any problems at a later stage. Internal communication, often overlooked. Strategies should be just, oh, let's go and do it. But actually, to avoid any resistance internally by selling at a lower price in one country than another, will nip any problems in the bud, and really make sure that that your strategy becomes a success also internally. Changing prices, easily said, but sometimes more difficult than to actually do it. If you, for example, are switching discounts around inside your pricing structure, but the customer is equally well off, then it's probably easier than if you're, for example, completely changing the pricing picture or you're increasing prices in some markets. But price structure differentiation or price structure reorganization is usually somewhat easier to do, especially if you could communicate well about it, which is also the point about the external communication. So it's communication about the changes, and of course there's also communication about sometimes about the risks. International pricing risk is not really something to do, but good and well-organized pricing teams already have some tools in place or some defenses in place, so that if they run into situations with international key accounts or with gray markets, the whole pricing strategy is engineered in such a way that they can handle differentiated prices in different markets. And of course, in the end, the continuous adjustment of the strategy. So if you see the markets are changing, if you see that some markets are maybe not so high growth potential anymore, well, then how do you go about then adjusting them and changing your pricing strategy accordingly if there's no more growth potential to be had in the market? That's actually one of the examples we often see as it's a strategic challenge. It's actually easier to categorize a market today. Say, well, this is an emerging market, and we really need to price aggressively in an emerging market. But once that market matures, and it's difficult both internally but also externally to say, oh well, you're now a mature market, so how do I go and just increase your price? It's one of the typical challenges you will get as well when you're looking at differentiated pricing strategies over time. So with that, it's the end of my presentation. We've had a couple of questions already on the chat in the GoToMeeting software. One is, are there discount types that are better suited than others for differentiated pricing across borders? Well, definitely. Definitely, it does depend, of course, on the industry, what kind of discount types you would normally differentiate. But if you're looking at something that typically has an end customer impact, so if you are in if you're in consumer goods, then it's an impact on the final consumer. So if you're running promotions in a different market, if you are in industrial components, then the final component builder, or the final product builder, if you can influence them, that's typically much better than things that are in a direct relationship between you and the customer. So in the consumer example, if you're a manufacturer of consumer goods and you're selling to a retailer, rebates that only benefit the retailer are, yes, of course, you can differentiate them between markets, but you will probably get a harder time arguing to the retailer why they need to get 10% in Poland and 5% in Germany. Whereas if it's something that you are giving to the retailer to pass on to the consumer, then there may be a much better case to argue that, well, it is because the Polish consumer, we want to achieve certain things with the Polish consumer that we don't really want to achieve with the German consumer. And similarly, if you are in a B2B environment where, let's say, you're selling spare parts to machinery, if you differentiate on the use of the final machine, then again you can better argue, well, this kind of machinery is used in a different way in Portugal than it is in China, and therefore we also need to give the end customer some benefits there. Whereas if you're just giving it to the initial customer, then it's more difficult to argue why there should be differences. Of course, other types of discount types that are better suited for differentiating pricing than others are anything that is non-exportable. So if you're giving discounts for getting certain performances from the customer at a local level, and if he doesn't perform those services to you on the local level, then again you can hold that discount back, and he can't export it if he just exported the goods rather than consuming them in the local market. Another question on the chat. Can you give an example of how the compensation would work internally? You mentioned internal compensation if you have differentiated pricing in different markets. Yes, well, I think I already mentioned a little bit in the presentation, but it can be, for example, that well, the first question is, can you track that goods moving in from a lower price country to another? Which is not always the case. It's not always possible. And of course, a general manager in the high price market will always complain that internal budget negotiations about, oh, you know, I'm probably getting a lot of cheap goods coming in from my colleagues across the border. So what can I do? I can't deliver the budgets, or I need to lower budgets to compensate for that. But if you can track these kind of goods actually flowing around, in some industries there are either serial numbers on the goods or other ways of tracking it to some extent. That makes it more quantifiable, and then it's easier to say, okay, well, we tracked a certain number of goods coming across, or we lost a certain number of deals because of it, and therefore you should get either a lower budget or a lower target, even a bonus, full bonus, despite that you didn't hit your targets, if you can prove, or if we have tracking of of those goods moving around. If you don't, it's still possible. We have seen some organizations who are basically saying that, well, if a market is between 0 and 10% more expensive than a neighboring market, then we don't adjust. But if the market is more than 10%, which is also encouraging some markets to get a higher price, if they can achieve a higher price, by all means. If those markets are more than 10% above neighboring countries, then we allow for that they have a lower volume target or lower growth target, so they don't just go home and sleep, but a lower growth target than without. That can be communicated in advance of a budget process. But it's a sensitive area, and I'll be happy to take more, speak to you also offline after the webinar to discuss it further. Another question here: is the proper brand management, brand diversification, a good tool to differentiate pricing in emerging and mature markets? Really good question. It's definitely been used in some countries, or in some industries, in some companies. A very good example that we probably all know is, because of the consumer goods brands, is Unilever, who has a lot of different brands, but there's many different companies do it. So basically the concept is that if you have a different brand name in the cheap country and in the expensive country, then you can really differentiate your price. Because no one really discovers it. You're also not destroying your brand image, and to a large extent it works. It works better than just differentiating pack sizes or technical specifications on the same brand. We definitely see that as a tactic, or even as a strategy, it works quite well. That said, we have also seen that in certain industries, in particular in certain more technically oriented industries, that if there's no real differentiation on the product, but it's only the name and not much else, then some of the international buyers will still go in and say, well, yeah, maybe you call it X in one country and Q in another country and beta in another third country, but in reality, because it's technically doing the same thing, we don't consider there's a difference. Actually, it probably works more when the brand value or is bigger. So that's typically in consumer goods. It's typically in certain other industries where the customer will put a lot of value on the brand itself. Then it works very well. But we see it in many industries, and it is quite a good strategy for many companies. Obviously, there are some operational challenges if you have to manage different brands, from a production perspective or from a communication perspective. You're losing some benefits of being able to communicate at an international level about your brand because you have different brands in different countries. So there's always pros and cons, but overall, I would consider one of the better tools. And with that, we have spent now the 1 hour on the webinar. I don't have any more questions. If you do have any more questions afterwards, as I said, we will send the presentation as a PDF, and we have also been recording the webinar. We will be able to share both with you. And if you have any more questions, please do contact us, and we'll be more than happy to answer any more questions you have. And we can also give you a more detailed feedback on your specific company and your specific industry on this topic. So with that, thank you very much for your time today, and have a nice day.